All right, welcome everyone. As it is customary already, I have the pleasure to give you a little update of what has happened in the field of AI, because I think it's always nice if you're not following all the steps that are happening in this crazy industry to get once a year a general update of some curated facts of what is out there. So who am I? I have the pleasure to be one of the founding partners at TheVentury. I am there responsible for everything backend and data engineering. I am also the CTPO of our own venture, BotBase. If you want to know more about that, ask me. And I have the pleasure to be in the ISO committee, Joint Technical Committee 1, for the standardization of artificial intelligence. Yes, that is actually fun. So status quo briefing on artificial intelligence, and for the returning guests, if you remember my keynote from last year, I said that there is no real standard what we define as AI. Spoiler, there still isn't, right? So that's why I want to give like a 30 seconds introduction of what is the best possible definition that we came up with. And then I want to look at 3 different fields where I think last year, since the last keynote, something major happened. I want to look at strategy. I want to look at text, and I want to look at voice synthesis. Because I think there were some very interesting things that everyone should be knowing about. Good, let's dive right in. So artificial intelligence. There is artificial intelligence, a definition according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Yes, not the Wikipedia. And as it generally is in the standardization industry, this is still the best definition we have. Let's go through it. Artificial intelligence, AI, is the ability of a digital computer or computer-controlled robot to perform tasks commonly associated with intelligent being. Yes, it can be a little bit more vague, right? So tasks commonly associated with intelligent being does not mean consciousness. It does not mean Terminator. It does not mean any of this. It means that we look at the task and then say, do we normally associate that task with some things human being or conscious beings do, right? And that obviously changes over time, because obviously the more we learn about technology, the more we learn about things that haven't been done or things that could be done in the future, and we associate more and more AI with it. So this boundary always like slightly moves. There's a funny definition out there that says AI is everything that has not been invented yet. Because if it is invented, we tend to give it a different name. We call it deep learning, we call it statistical analysis, we call it linear regressions or whatever, and it drops out of the term of what AI means. And I like that definition because it gives us this mystical thing that is very hard to define in a sense out there. Good. So now we roughly know what we're speaking about. Let's look at some updates. Strategy. Why I think strategy is so important? Because a vision without a strategy remains an illusion. Only when we have the vision where we want to go and the system is actually able to go through a strategy to that process, we tend to have something that makes actually sense. I showed this example last demo day for everyone who's remembered. Here you see a brilliant invention from Google AlphaStar playing the game StarCraft 2. And last demo day I reported that the AlphaStar is so good that it is becoming a good player in the field of that game. So if you don't know, StarCraft 2, it's a giant game, especially in Korea. There are giant tournaments, people filling stadiums around this. And they were able to produce an AI that is good at that game. It's a real-time strategy game, so you have to really plan on demand. There are no rounds. You really have to react to everything. Well, a couple of weeks ago, they actually presented that their AlphaStar progressed to a level that they can beat 99.8% of all the players worldwide. So within less than a year, we came from a good player to probably beating every human being on that planet in that game. And I think that really shows that we tend to think linear, but it actually goes exponential. So you might not say, Jacob, why should I care about a computer game? Why should I care about stuff that happens somewhere with some nerds? Well, let's switch out the game. Do you care now? Because if we switch the game for another real-time game where we have multiple players involved in bringing their strategy, suddenly it becomes interesting. Suddenly it becomes tangible to think about why we're doing progress there. So strategy, super important, because if the system can play along and the system can plan its move and can plan where it's going, this can give you a real advantage. Second thing, voice synthesis. Because words mean more than what it is said on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with deeper meaning. We all know the robots' voices that we get on IVRs or that we get on something that is very badly synthesized. So it is really important because we human beings, we tend to associate with the voice, we talk with people. So this is the final output for us to really get a conversational interface as something that we find intrinsically interesting to talk about and intrinsic to work with. So there is the TheVentury model, and that's very interesting because this model was trained on 15,000 different real human voices. And that model is interesting because it can take a 5-second input of a real human voice and then synthesize any sentence in any length in that voice out of it. Don't believe me? I brought some examples. All right, so here's the 5-second real human voice input.
The Norsemen considered the rainbow as a bridge over which the gods passed from Earth to their home in the sky.
Very specific, Viking legend, no specific words in there. Let's see how they do on the first sentence. This is now computer generated out of that model.
There are several listings for gas station.
Second.
Here's the forecast for the next 4 days.
Now it gets a little bit difficult.
This work reflects a quest for lost identity, a recuperation of an unknown past.
And now super difficult.
Modern birds are classified as coelurosaurs by nearly all paleontologists.
That's pretty solid, right? So whenever you have a 5-second sample of a human being, you can now make that human being say anything. Just think about the implications here. Cool, so voice synthesis. Coming up, autonomous writing. I thought I'd like this, like autonomous writing, because everything is autonomous nowadays. Because a word after word after word means power, right? And here I want to talk about the GPT2 model that was released over the last year. And what was really interesting is that the GPT-2 is the largest transformer-based language model out there with 1.5 billion parameters that go into that language model. And is trained on a set of 8 million pages, mostly Wikipedia pages, but also other pages out there. And it has a single simple objective, and that makes it beautiful. Predict the next word, given all the previous words that you have, right? And then if you have the next word, you can predict the next word, and it becomes a phrase, and if the next word, it becomes a paragraph, and then it becomes a sentence, and then it becomes a whole paragraph, and then it becomes a whole page, right? So how good does that work? Well, this text that now follows was not written by a human being. This was written by GPT-2. And the input that I gave the algorithm was, before boarding your rocket to Mars, remember to pack these things. Output. On your mission in preparation. A good idea is a survival kit. Space is dangerous. You're going to be far away from all of humanity, which means that some things may be different around you. Your survival kit should have everything you would need to survive for a few days, a few weeks, or even a few years. You'll need a good water purifier system and a supply of fresh air. You'll need to have enough food and supply to make it through the journey. And the worst that will happen is you'll have to deal with an occasional bug or animal to prepare for that. That was not written by a human being. This was written by the algorithm, predicting the next word given all the words before that. And if you can see, this somewhat makes good sense, right? It kind of got that it has a list that we're asking for certain things in the item. It already got the preparation that you might start with something like a survival kit and then go for a spacesuit, right? So, and it's also not too illogical, the things it writes under each chapter. And that came out of a simple algorithm that you just give it a sentence and it generates everything else out of it. So I think this is really incredible. So the findings that came out of the GPT-2 research, humans find the output really, really convincing. They have done a lot of studies in giving people actual text that was written by humans and text that was written by GPT-2. There is barely a difference, and people are not able to recognize the difference between those two if it is well trained. What's interesting is that with very little effort, these models can be fine-tuned for something that I call synthetic propaganda. No, I will not call it fake news. I'll call it by its name. And synthetical propaganda is really, really dangerous because it is so easy to produce. I just have to give it a sentence, and I can produce entire articles, entire manuals out of it that somewhat make sense. It don't have to be like super clean, but it has to make somewhat sense. And the problem with that is we're still struggling to find a detection algorithm. Because those algorithms are so good in writing, the algorithms to protect us from that are in its infancy in terms of detecting those outliers. So we very often still need a human being to say like, oh, this is somewhat incorrect, but that obviously goes in a very different speed than what the algorithm can produce in terms of text. So what I also think is really interesting is the precedent that GPT-2 set when they released the data set. Because they were so afraid that the data set could be misused that they decided to split the data set in multiple chunks and over the period of a year only release certain parts of that model to give the general public a way of adjusting to what that data set means. And I think that's a really nice precedent of how people think about the ethics in AI, to not release all the newest thing out there, but give actually the market and the society and the technology time to adjust to those changes that are out there. And what's really interesting for me, and that quite nicely leads then into the second part of our keynote, is we need standards in the way how we treat biases and in the way how we detect synthetical propaganda. This is really important for us because if we have standards, we can hold ourselves accountable to some standards, what means what's happened to the model and what can actually be produced out of it. And that's why, for example, standardization is important, because then every business partner, every scientist can know where the border is that we want to follow in that society. So that was basically the introduction part. And I'm now really, really happy to give the mic to our data engineer at TheVentury, Josh Kunkle, to give the actual keynote. That was just the laudatio, basically, to biases in AI and deepen our knowledge in it. Josh, come on stage.
Yeah, so as Jakob mentioned, I'm going to talk about bias in AI. And we're thinking, maybe it's really the next big challenge in AI in some cases. So in AI before, the challenge really was, we need data and we need good algorithms. So we have that now. But in some cases, we're seeing that our AI is gaining biases. And of course, we don't want that. So how is that happening? Well, the problem is that AI has to learn from us. We have to provide it the data so it can behave how we want. One interesting example of this is called Tay. And so this was Microsoft's Twitter bot. It was in 2016 that they deployed it, and the idea was go out to Twitter and learn how to tweet from Twitter. Well, what happened is it quickly started making racist, sexist, offensive tweets, and they took it down. It was only up for less than a day. So what happened here? So what happened is this bot was allowed to learn from all of Twitter, very open data set, and whether accidentally or intentionally, it learned to make these offensive tweets. So clearly, if we let it learn openly, that can be a problem. Usually we have a more contained data set that we want it to learn from. But the problem is, if the biases are in us and then we create the data, well then that goes to the AI as well. So a really interesting example of this was in Amazon. So they're a really big company. And what they did is they say, well, we have all of this data from CVs, and they hire many people. So they trained an AI with their CVs and their hiring decisions to hire new people. But since tech jobs historically have too few women, the AI also learned to prefer men over women. And what happened here is Amazon said, well, it's biased. What are we going to do? They stopped using it. They threw it away. So all that effort went for basically nothing because they didn't address the biases that are clearly there. I think there's another example of this in Austria's AMS. I think maybe you heard about it. They also did something similar and also found that were criticized because it was biased against women. And it's also interesting for us because 3 of our startups that you'll hear soon are in the HR realm. So it's a very exciting area, but also challenging in this sense. Another example is AI used in the judicial system. This happens a lot in the US, so you take data of judicial outcomes, so either of bail fines or sentencing to decide how to sentence somebody in the future. And the important thing here is that this has a huge impact on people's lives, so it should receive a lot of scrutiny, especially if it's being biased against minorities because of past racial discrimination. So the key is that AI are becoming more and more ingrained into our processes, and it's making bigger and bigger decisions. So we really need to be careful about how things like bias can affect it. So you might say, yeah, the AI is biased because it learned from humans. Maybe it's just as bad as humans, maybe it's better. But that's not good enough, right? We really need to demand that the AI is the better human, because it's just in some sense it's development. It's time spent understanding the data, and so we can really put in that effort to make it the best thing possible and hold it to the higher standard and not have these biases. So the challenge in doing that is that the computer, the AI, doesn't know our biases. It doesn't know anything about human nature or human history. So we have to identify our own biases. For example, very common ones like gender, age, race. But even, it could be other ones. For example, economic status or education level. And you might say, well, wait a minute. If I'm hiring somebody, of course I want to discriminate on education level. But, if you're offering a public service, then you probably don't want to discriminate on education level. So it's not always easy, right? It can be can have fine lines drawn between them. So you really have to think about it in order to tell the AI what's good and what's bad. So how do we do it? So given what I've said, and given how much, we can see that bias is ingrained in our history and our human nature, I think a tech solution, which we all like to try to find, is not going to be good enough. It's going to be, at best, it's going to be a bandage on top of this deeper wound. We'd like to do more than that, right? So how do we do that? So I'd like to organize our bias, how biases can enter, especially into business practices, in this way. So the tech solution is at the top. It's sitting above everything else that can introduce bias into our processes. At the bottom is our sort of intrinsic biases, our societal biases. So, if you want to hire women in tech, well, there's fewer women in tech because of some really deep issues that are like intrinsic bias. So how do you deal with that as a company? How do you deal with that? It's of course extremely hard, but we should all see it as a responsibility. So, for example, you can support your employees in outreach to the community, to try to encourage people to encourage women to take up tech jobs, for example, in the future. And this is something we actually do at TheVentury, which I thought was really cool in supporting people and women in tech. So on top of that are business practices, for example, like hiring, and that means putting in the effort to hire people who are diverse. So broadening your pool of potential employees. In development practices, so that means giving developers the time and support needed to actually evaluate where biases can enter into the procedures of actually developing a product. And then in data analytics, it comes to the data. So giving data scientists the support to find the biases in the data, to understand the data. And then maybe once you've done all that, you can bring in the tech solution. And so that allows you to correct the biases that are in the data. But if you don't really address it in a more significant way, the biases are going to keep coming in. The tech solution is not really going to solve it overall. So given all that, let's talk a little bit about tech solutions. So it's a three-step process. So first, you want to derive a mathematical description of bias. So you say, I want the ratio to be the same between two groups. You say, there's many different definitions. Once you have that, you can calculate it. You can look at your data, or you can look at your model, and you can calculate it. So you measure it. So you make, let's say, a graph, and you look at males versus females in whatever data you might have. And if there's a difference there, you say, that's a bias. They should be equal into this acceptable range, but they're different, so that's a bias. And it could be with any attribute, like I said before, gender, race, age, anything that you think would be important to check in your data. Once you've done that and you said, well, okay, I did find a bias, what can I do about it? Then you can modify the data perhaps. So the data, in machine learning, we make a lot of data transformations. So in some sense, it's another way to transform the data so that after you do that, you make it less biased. And so you might say, wow, that seems like it could be really complicated. And perhaps it is, but there are actually tools out there to do it. So there are some enterprise tools that you can find, which are interesting. I'd like to point out an open source tool from IBM. They call it Fairness 360. And so it's sort of a toolkit that can be used to understand and correct your biases. So this is an example they have on their website. It's a demo. And they have a data set, and they measure with respect to here sex and here race. And you see a similar thing like I showed before, and it shows that, there's some bias. So then you can use their tool to correct the data or the model to make your data less biased. And this is something we're looking at TheVentury to see how we can plug in different data sets and correct biases in them. Okay, so then here are my suggestions. Have a diverse team and support employees in outreach. So to try to address the fundamental causes of bias. Dedicate time and resources. So that means giving your employees time and the abilities to identify bias in project planning and in data science, and then bring in tech solutions if needed. So really what is at issue here is that unmitigated bias could really cripple your AI project. So you need to dedicate resources from the beginning and consider it in all elements of a business and society. And really, we should all take a responsibility to address bias. If you're interested in more, you can look at a blog that I wrote and also have a look at the tool here. Thanks.
Well, perfect. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Jacob. I gotta say, it's absolutely fantastic of how you guys at TheVentury address bias also offline, not just with AI, but you're really striving for diverse teams, and I'm absolutely thrilled to not only have male pitchers up here today, but a really diverse group. So good job to you guys. Big round of applause.